We are now very, very fortunate to have as our keynote speaker Professor Yolanda Moses. Yolanda is a Professor of Anthropology and the former Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity and Excellence at the University of California, Riverside. Her research has looked at diversity and change in universities in the United States, India, Europe, South Africa, and now Australia. And we've been very lucky to have her in our midst last year, and we're very, very thrilled to have you back here this week. Thank you.
I'm speaking today about beyond diversity and inclusion. I'm calling this creating culturally competent institutions for a socially just world. And I wanted to put that out there so everybody knows where I'm coming from, and this is not anything new for me. I have been a social justice warrior from the beginning of my academic career, and I'm a granny now. So I have a second and a third generation of young people to indoctrinate about the importance of this issue. I have been a scholar administrator, I call myself, as well as an activist, because my leadership positions as a faculty member, as a department chair, as a dean, as a provost, as a university president, as the head of a national higher ed association in the US, have all been in service to pushing that social justice agenda in higher education. So when I had the opportunity to come to the University of Sydney last year, it was like, oh yes, this is something very, very important, because what they're proposing to do here at the University of Sydney is something we talk about doing in the States a lot. We give a lot of lip service to, but in terms of institutional change, that we're not there yet. There are very few of us there. So I want this to be a conversation about dilemmas, about institutional identities, and what if it would look like if we were to move toward institutional models based on cultural competence for social justice. And there was a time in the United States, I'd say during the Reagan administration, during the 90s before Bill Clinton came into office, where you didn't talk about social justice. That was not something you talked about openly in universities. So I am putting it out there because it's important for us to be intentional about what it is we're trying to do, and to say that whenever we can. So I can say that here. We're doing that. And to talk about three promising practices that I want to share with you, and then to talk about the way forward, because as Dr. Good said, this is a journey we're all on, and each of your institutions are at different points in that journey, and you know where that is, and you know where those tough spots are that you have to deal with. So we're going to go through this. So I'll be flying up, I'll be zooming out and zooming in terms of what I have to say. Dilemmas. You ask, and then you decide whether or not this is something that applies to your institution as well. Most of us who work in higher education sector today are aware that controversy and tension currently abound on our campuses, college and university campuses in the US, Canada, in Europe, in Australia, Latin America. It's a global kind of phenomena. These issues are around such things as unrest stemming from clashes over the limits of free speech, who gets to decide, re-examine campus histories. We have a lot of those kinds of controversies going on in the United States. Heightened student protests around any number of things, And any of you who lived through the 70s and the 80s know that this is not a new phenomenon on campus, on campuses, and that students have been, if nothing else, the vanguard for social change that has happened in many of our institutions. But we're also facing external challenges to higher education from very powerful political and economic pressures. And some are even questioning whether or not everybody needs to go to college or have a university education, whether or not that is something that is important. And I say this because after 30-some years, this is a time when our institutions are starting to admit more people who have historically been underrepresented across a lot of fields, more women across a lot of fields, more international students across a lot of fields. That is until President Trump, decided that was not a good thing for us to be doing. So you have people who are questioning the value of liberal scientific and professional education, particularly education that has embedded in it issues of inclusion and helping students to think about complex issues in complex ways versus skimming across the surface. So we're in a very divisive mode in the US, needless to say. And if we look around the world, we see periods also of extreme divisiveness. That is, people are torn in how we respond to such issues as the refugee crisis in our own country, but also in other countries as well. And we see the rise of populism and nationalism and fascism across the nation as well. We see the very questioning of scientific information, such as global warming. We see increasing racial violence across the world, not just in the United States, and class warfare. We see healthcare only relegated, more and more being only relegated to the wealthy and to those people who can afford to have healthcare. So these highly complex issues and the result of this discord often leave our students, our faculty, and our campus administrators in a quandary about how to respond to these pressures. So in some cases, they do nothing. And then we have chaos, at least from the perspective of the students. We find that when we look at the US, that we talk at one level about diversity and inclusion, and at another level, our institutions stay the same in terms of their response to these issues, as if saying it over and over is going to make it so, without questioning, internally questioning the institutional premises, the institutional missions, the institutional values. So this presentation will explore these quandaries, yes, as obstacles, but through a cultural competency and diversity lens that I believe can provide opportunities for us to think outside the box, and sometimes you all say outside the square, but it's the same thing. It's an opportunity to say, what is the role of the university in continuing to build and strengthen civil society? Because that's really what is kind of on the line here. We're talking about who gets to decide what our democracies will look like. Colleges and universities can be these democratic spaces, both socially and even more important, morally. places where these moral questions can be asked and answered, as evidenced by movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement that have come to our university campuses, and the March for Life that was just staged in the United States this last week, which involved a whole new generation of young people in feeling they have a role to play in keeping democracy alive and making it inclusive. If you see and look at those pictures. So, the idea of 2018, what does a university look like where nobody is left behind? It's part of the dilemmas. Sorry, I'm having allergy flare-ups. So the next thing I want to talk about are institutional identities in the US. And also all of you pretty much are from Australia, New Zealand, and Torres Strait Islands. And for you to ask these questions, at a conference like this, who are our institutions set up for historically and today? Were they set up for the kind of work that we're talking about doing? Or is that going to be a part of our job? Are we in need of new missions? Who are we accountable to? As individuals, you report to someone. But who's the institution accountable to do this work? If you're a public institution, you're accountable to the government, to the state, right? If you're a private institution, which we have several in the United States as well, you're accountable to your boards, to people who give you money, who tell you what you can and cannot do. And if they are not a part of this change process, then you're setting yourself up for the kind of pushback that has to be dealt with as a systemic issue. So the question is, are we as institutions equipped to have these conversations on our campuses? Not just us in this room, because as someone says, we may have a lot of people here who are the choir, that we're preaching to the choir. Well, you know what, the choir needs tuning up periodically so that we can continue to sing our best in those spaces where we need to sing, and sing loudly sometimes in terms of that. If we do not have these conversations, and this is where we are in a lot of spaces in the United States, we have all these wonderful statements and proclamations in our mission statements and in our aspirational work that we want to do, but the needle doesn't move. The needle stays the same. So if we don't have some of these difficult conversations, then what we're doing really is reifying or certifying or recertifying the status quo. So we're talking about one thing, wanting this thing to happen, and then at another level, we're not doing what we say we want to do. So to do that, institutions of higher education in partnership with other institutions, and these are civil society institutions. So the question is, are we cities on the hill, which is how we talked about universities historically in the United States, separate and apart from society, or are we institutions that are critically engaged in the work of helping to build civil society where we find the need to do so? We have to, again, examine core issues of institutional identities, and most of the private institutions in the United States were not set up for women. They were not set up for underrepresented minorities. And if you go to some of them, you can see that they're not set up for differently abled folks either. And they don't care, right? So if we think about who this institution was not set up for, then how can we as individuals do that work? That is the work, the heavy lifting work of institutions to do that. And I do a lot of consultation with universities who want to, set up diversity programs and what have you. And I basically say, if your institution is not ready to do this work, you're going to run yourself ragged as an individual. And then, guess what? Institutions don't hug back. They will say, oh, so-and-so was so good at her job. Step over that body and keep going. Because that's what institutions do. They preserve themselves. So how do you get in there and change the mission of that institution? So what they should be about is social justice and inclusion and civic engagement and institutional change that's going to benefit society. So this means the whole campus should be involved. And so if I was to say toward institutional mode of cultural competence, what does it mean for us to look at cultural competence at a whole institutional level? Dr. Tawari Good yesterday laid out an aspirational model for us to follow. And she superimposed that on the work that she does with her organization nationwide. And what if we took that model and put it on universities? What would that look like? And so I want to suggest a few guideposts for us to look at along the way, because none of us are there yet. Making leadership case for diversity and cultural competence. As was stated by many of you yesterday, everybody has a role in this. This belongs to all of us, from the top of the institution to the bottom of the institution. And the chancellor, we call them different names, but you understand what I mean. The people at the top should be able to articulate these values as well as the staff and the students. Oh, the students know what they want. They can articulate that. Now, whether or not we can give them everything they want, that's another issue. But they're clear about what isn't working for them in the institution. And they will tell us what we do with that information is another thing. So it's distributed leadership, leading from the middle. There's all kinds of names for this, and I'm sure that Jean talked about the various styles of leadership earlier today. The mission statement is a place where a lot of this works. And if we have time in our question and answer session, I will tell you how important it has been for the University of California to have a mission statement that the regents got behind, because we're under a state decree that we can't do this work. We've been told we can't do this work by the state of California. So our mission statement has been critical to the work that we do, that defines achievement in this realm as excellence, that ties this work to our academic mission, that ties this work to effectiveness and efficiency in the students we graduate. So we've had an opportunity to think through how to make this work for the situation in which we find ourselves. And, we are a research-intensive system. I happen to be at the University of California, Riverside, but there are 9 other campuses, including Berkeley, UCLA, and Irvine, and on and on and on. But it was a joint project for us to do this work. This came from the faculty, endorsed by the administrators, endorsed by the Board of Regents, because even today, we are trolled every day by right-wing groups who want to sue us because we are doing this diversity work. Now, California is a deep blue state, which means, of course, we're sort of the resistance as we see ourselves in the United States on both coasts, right? California and the East Coast as well. But the idea is that this institute, our university, is not something anyone else outside tells us what is excellence and what is not excellence. And we will go to court. We will fight those lawsuits. We will do whatever it takes to have the ability to shape what the University of California is, how we value diversity. But in order to do that, we had to have culturally competent systems and people. This was not done individually, and I can talk about that. So there were also strategies and tactics that we used. Efficacy, looking at how we help the state of California with the work that we do, and to be very clear about what is the value added of using these words around diversity and inclusion to make our case to the state. And we put in assessment tools so that we can say to those naysayers, this is how we know we're doing a good job. This is not just about, people feeling good about this work. This is about us moving our institution from being a land-grant university, it's 150 years old this year, to being a land-grant university that started with one campus to being this powerhouse of research and economic development and teaching and learning for the state of California. And so that has been the way that our institution has dealt with the issue. Now, I want to talk about 3 examples of promising practices, I call them, where you see 3 different kinds of institutional types. We'll come back to the University of California again, around very sensitive and highly inflammatory issues, and how the difference in leadership made the situation palatable, how you take lemons and turn them into lemonade, and how you create whole new things out of what could have been or could have been disasters. Brown University is one of the top private liberal arts colleges in the United States. It's in the state of Rhode Island. Any of you heard of Rhode Island? Okay, I'm kidding. And in 2004, under the leadership of a woman by the name of Ruth Simmons, who was the first African-American woman in the United States to lead an Ivy League college. Under her leadership, it was discovered by students in history classes, right? We want our students to go back and look at history, that the founders, some of the very founders of that university, had been involved in the slave trade. So there were marches and demonstrations and administration buildings taken over and all kinds of things. And she had the foresight, in my opinion, because she had thought about these issues before they happened. That is, if you challenge students to do the deep learning, we want them to do, they're going to come up with stuff you're not going to want to hear. And you're definitely not going to want to deal with. And so that's exactly what happened. And in private, elite, liberal arts institutions that are very precious, you don't question history. You don't question the status quo. You don't go there. Well, she went there. And she appointed a commission, and this commission took all those voices, all those angry voices, and created an advisory group made up of historians, students, archaeologists, historians, to actually see what was real and what wasn't, to make a report, which took 2 years, so that gave people a chance to calm down, right? That was presented to the whole Board of Regents, and by that time, the Board of Regents had been educated about the importance of this issue. Now, none of them were the founding fathers or mothers of the university, so it wasn't personal to them. But it was personal to the alums and the alumni who didn't want any change, who didn't want the names taken off the buildings, who didn't want to have anything happen other than to have this venerated institution stay the way that it was. So what happened is that there were about 25 or 30 recommendations. Most of them were small things that could happen. But one of the things they wanted, students as well as the faculty and some community members, they wanted a memorial on the campus in a very prominent place where anybody walking by could see this was intentional. This is not over in the corner, in the part of the campus where nobody goes. This is in the center of the campus. And it is a picture. I don't know how well you can see that, but it is like a ball, a big ball, and coming out of it is a piece of a chain. And on it are the names of the founders of the university. And here, over in the corner there is a kiosk that has the history. So everybody can read it. So they decided in this case, she decided in this case it was worth it to go through this effort, to claim, to own that history, but to incorporate it into now. That's one case. The second one is my boss. President of the University of California in 2012, under the Obama administration, she was the Director of Homeland Security for the United States. And she created the DACA program. How many have heard of that? The deferred program for young kids who were brought into the country by their parents as children, as young children. And this program, in this program, she protected 800,000 students from being deported out of the United States. She became the president of the University of California, so she's over all the 10 campuses right now. And she's suing the president of the United States. To save the program, but to save those students, to save those kids. And in the US, in California, we have the largest proportion of DACA students because California is a gateway from Latin America, all the Latin American countries. And so we have students that come not by over the border walls that are going to be built, but usually by airplanes through LAX, right? And so, never mind, that's another whole lecture. But before she did this, she discussed this with the chancellors, 10 chancellors. We had town hall meetings on every campus, and the leadership of the campus had an opportunity to understand what the consequences could be for us as a university doing this. And if there had been a lot of pushback, she was committed not to do it. So the idea of walking your talk, being 220,000 students, 8,000 faculty, 20,000 staff strong, behind an initiative like this does give you strength to do those kinds of things, right? But you need that kind of leadership who understands what it means to do that. Now, the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, Dr. Teresa Sullivan is the president of that university. And in August of 2017, there was a march where young men with tiki torches had a rally, and they came through the campus, and they were chanting all kinds of nasty slogans and hate things about everybody. I mean, it was like, it was this litany of things. And what was different about this and what caught everybody off guard is that the assumption in the United States was only radical right-wing groups behave this way. Young people know better or would not do this kind of thing. Well, these are young white males with khaki and polo shirts on. They could be your neighbors. They could have been my neighbors in terms of how they looked. They had no hoods on their heads, but spouting the same kind of vitriol. And some of them were, in fact, students at the University of Virginia. So this is a work in progress because everybody, as I said, was taken off guard by this and we're not quite sure institutionally how to handle this. So there's a lot of cultural competency building going on at this moment, from the police to the senior leadership to people who just assumed nothing like this would ever happen. At the campus of Virginia, this, of course, is the place where the University of Thomas Jefferson built. I'm just saying. And this speaks to the question that I had raised before about was this institution, when it was built by Thomas Jefferson, was it built for everybody? It was not built for everybody. But 2018, the university is reaching its arms out to bring in people who have not been there before. And this is the welcome that many of them have received. So it's enough to give you pause. And then the quote here is from John Gates, who is the Dean of Diversity in the School of Engineering and Applied Science, which makes that case. This was not a university set up for the students who are here. And that pisses off some people. But this is the institution we are, and we're going to be. And we have to grow into our shoes. So that's what's happening at this institution. And I wanted to share that with you because, you know, lest you think that somehow we have it all figured out. We don't. because every day we're seeing what we thought had been eradicated, hate behavior, is coming out of the woodwork, where it has always been. It had just been more hidden than it is now. So that is also about leadership and enabling leadership as well. So as we think about critical times, we're at this critical time where you have young people who first generation university, college going students whose parents are scrimping and scraping, students across the spectrum, to send them to universities, because yes, they do cost money, and yes, there is sacrifice for higher education. And it's like, if institutions are not self-reflective about themselves and who they are, then you're going to have a revolving door policy. And those of you who do faculty hiring, you see the same thing happening with diverse hires. That is, you do all the work to recruit women and underrepresented minorities into positions, and a year or two later, they're gone. And you go, wow, we spent all that time recruiting them and they didn't stay. And not asking the question that should be asked, and that was my job, one of my jobs when I was the chief diversity officer, as they went out the door, was to get exit interviews, right? To find out why you left. Well, they're not going to tell their dean or department chair why they left. They'll tell me, because it's a confidential meeting. And most of them just felt isolated and put upon and ignored or given all the shit work to do. Oh, did I say that? Well, within the department. And if the other side of that is recruitment, the other side of that is retention, right? So if retention is about creating that climate, that safe space, those places where people can be successful, then it requires self-reflexivity, and institutions are just not good at doing that. And so that's something we have to help them do with the work that we are doing here today. Why don't more institutions do this kind of work? Well, some of it has to do with being averse to risks. Yeah, what are some of those risks? Well, in private institutions, it has to do with benefactors and money to help with endowed chairs and things like that. In public institutions, it has to do with how enlightened your political state house is, as we call them. And many of our state houses in the United States are very conservative. And I'll just give you two examples. One is the University of Tennessee. The University of Tennessee, the senators and legislators decided they were gonna not give the University of Tennessee any money because they didn't like their diversity and inclusion programs. So they were gonna just strip that out of the budget. And they had the authority to do that. At the University of Wisconsin, the State House is thinking about taking faculty tenure away because these faculty are too radical. They're talking about diversity and inclusion and critical race theory. What is critical race theory? And white privilege, what is that? And guess who all these legislators are? Irony, huh? Irony, irony. But they have the power to do that. So there are some times when institutions say, well, it may be too risky for us to do that, so maybe we'll just be silent and we can we can weather the storm. We can wait till that legislature is voted out, and then we can, put in people that are more amenable to the kind of work that we want to do. But I think it's important that we know ourselves and we know our institutions in a very deep way. My training is as a cultural anthropologist, and so for me, culture, understanding your culture, your institution's culture, is really, really important for you to understand where those leverages of change are and where they can be. Understanding the barriers to institutional change, both that are observed and that are hidden, and many of them are hidden. And for me, in my years of doing administrative work and also being a professor, is that it's often the people who say, oh yes, I am supportive of this, that are just paying lip service to the work that you're trying to do, the heavy lifting. And you appreciate the people who tell you they don't like you and don't like the work that you're doing, because at least you know what you're dealing with. And how to create counter arguments. Because if you do, you find out that a lot of people are just afraid of what's going to happen. I'll give you an example. We had a huge hiring opportunity where we brought in 200 faculty in 1 year at our university. And the senior faculty just went apoplectic because it's like, okay, all the resources and the focus is going to be on these folks, and nobody's looking at us. And we've been here a long time, and these folks are coming in making more money than we made, and we've been working here all this time. So you have these issues that, unless they're addressed, can turn into something really, really dreadful. So one of the things we did was to bring together folks and talk about this, because the people who were saying this were very vocal, and to talk about it. And so we said, what would make you feel whole? What would make you feel, and so you were also a part of this change process, and I excluded. And some of them were not doing research anymore, some of them were, at the point where they had sort of given and were kind of winding down. We created this program where they were mentoring these younger people as they were coming in. And they were given credit for that. This was not seen as something extra, but it was something that actually helped them. And so by focusing on the fears and confronting them head on and creating an institutional program to address them, you got those out of the way. But it's the people who had the silent agenda that, well, you certainly didn't know how to handle that. The other thing, as we go forward, for you to think about is how to form alliances with folks who will speak on your behalf when you are not in the room. And that is unlikely bedfellows. I guess that's a good way of saying it. Where are the synergies and where are the opportunities for you to bring your programs together and strengthen those programs through opportunity? In the US, it was under President Obama's administration, so Trump might step on it, but he wanted to raise the number of STEM graduates in the United States, and to do it by 20 some outrageous time, right? And how are you going to do that unless you include people who hadn't been included before in this process? And so the partnerships came through the National Science Foundation and other foundations recognizing this as an opportunity and incentivizing work between programs on campuses that had never worked together before. And I'm sure you all have stories about that, and maybe you can tell some of those stories as well when you're when you're doing it. Because again, there's strength in numbers, and you're fulfilling an opportunity that is a need for your community and for your region and maybe even for your state. Also, you must be able to speak for people who are not in the room. I can't even recount the number of times I had people who would say to me, oh, I was just in a meeting where you should have been. Because they were talking about diversity and inclusion. And I said, and what did you say about that topic? Oh, well, you do it so much better. Yes, I do. But if it's everybody's responsibility, then there are times when you have to speak up. Not you. I know you guys do. But people have to take that on, take that responsibility on, because if we're not speaking up for people who are not in the room, and we know they're not going to be in the room, then their perspectives and voices and their desires and their cares are not going to be on the table. So that's something else. The other thing is to be opportunistic. Know what's coming on the horizon. If you have to be on committees that are looking at the future and that have money. Because that will allow you to get ahead of the curve and say, how can we tie this, what we want to do, with institutional goals? And who can we bring in to help our institution see this is the right thing to do? And so that's where the community engagement can come in as well. The way forward is also about educating our students so that they can speak for others and be a part of other movements. I picked this particular picture because more and more we're seeing white middle-class students in the United States in parades, in protests, where inequality happens. They're protesting social injustice. And guess where they get the information from? From their ethnic studies courses, from their gender studies courses, from the courses in the university that give them the unvarnished history of the United States and gives them research and data that they have not heard before. And many of them are just simply outraged that they have not heard this before. Why have we not heard this before? Why was this not taught in our high schools, right? Why have we not heard this before? And some of them go home and rail with their parents. I know because I've heard from some of them. What are you guys teaching there at that university, right? And then the other one is the protest just a few weeks ago on no more guns, right? Right? No more guns. And this is a picture from Australia. So with social media, with the whole awareness that these young people have about social injustice, we're in a good, I think, position to have allies to help us with our work on campuses and in our communities. Another way forward, and this is something that's sitting right on your table here in Australia, is, whose Australia is this going to be? And how do you decide that? Where are these conversations taking place? Who are the honest brokers for these conversations? Clearly, it's not in the state houses, right? Or in politics. It's in our classrooms. It's in the work that we all are doing on our campuses. And that has to continue, I think. If we look across campuses, I've been speaking about campuses, right, institutions. If we look across institutions, if we start looking at forming alliances, if we start looking at what is happening worldwide with the rise of populism and fascism, here in Australia with your one-party movement, in Europe with the other nationalist groups, in the US with our own nationalist groups. Who will hold this line? I mean, what institutions are creating spaces where these conversations can be had about the dangers of going down this road without contesting what is happening? And because it's happening over here, because it's happening over there, because it's happening over there, it's happening over there, who sees the global picture? We do, and we can. And that is part of the work that we have to do as well. We teach what we teach our students, all of our students. It's critical for this pushback against fake news, which is not just local, right? And gaslighting and Russian hacking. They will be the next generation, hopefully, of woke leaders. And by that, I mean to understand that what they see and read isn't always true. Have you seen the fake picture of Emma Gonzalez, the young woman from Parkland High School, who, in the original photo, she was tearing up the picture of the target practice that they use for AK-47s? She was tearing that up. Well, the fake news blog came out with her tearing up something, but it was the Constitution of the United States that had been superimposed on that picture. So that's the kind of engagement and discernment that our students have to have if they're going to push back against media that is well furnished with dark money, as Jane Mayer talks about in her books, as the Koch brothers. I talked about them in another talk I gave last year. These folks are being funded by right-wing groups that don't want what we're doing to take hold. Well, it already has. The question is, how are they going to stop it? How are they going to tamp it down? How are they going to manage? How are they going to manage democracy? How are they going to manage social justice? And they can't. I mean, bottom line is they can't. So we must learn how to use these platforms and work with our students to get the information that we come up with in the hands of policymakers. In the 70s, policymakers were using conservative research to try to defund the war on poverty and those kinds of programs. We need to be the place where the data comes out to show what the positive impact is with funding certain kinds of programs for society as a whole. Because at least in my country, where people are averse to science, period, our EPA director is going to run his office without any kind of research. But that is fleeting in time. That's a window, and that window is going to close. So I would just like to end, thank you. Oops. Not quite that fast, but this is my conclusion. We cannot give fear or silence a place in our institutions. And I say this to everybody. If not us, then who is going to do the job of keeping our inclusive democracy on track? We must not fear losing the support of our privileges to call out false claims. And through our research and our writings, our pedagogy, our teaching, we can prevail. We must not give fear or silence a place in any of our institutions. Thank you.